Hello, I'm Warren Mansell, and this is my talk on perceptual control theory in neuroscience, psychiatry, and psychotherapy. I'm going to be explaining perceptual control theory and using examples of my own research to illustrate it. I'm going to be covering the principles of control, conflict, levels, or the hierarchy, and reorganization. These are the fundamentals of PCT. I'm not going to cover the whole interdisciplinary range of work drawn from perceptual control theory, but an edited book last year has a sample of these, and we're working on volume 2 at the moment. I'm also not going to cover robotics, but PCT robotics is an emerging area where research groups across the world are building robots, simulations based on PCT. And these are, in many cases, proof of concept of these basic principles. I'm also not going to cover in detail the range of research that pertain to this area. On this slide are a number of key references that give an overview of some of the key research papers relating to this domain. As I say, the talk is illustrative. So what is perceptual control theory? To put it simply, it's a psychological form of homeostasis. So rather than physiological variables being controlled, in PCT it's sensory inputs that are controlled, and they are controlled via actions on the environment. So whereas homeostasis situates within the body, the idea of PCT is that inputs, experiences, perceptions, incoming signals are controlled via actions through aspects of the environment, moving around, using tools, etc. And this continuous process is keeping a person's experiences at a just right state. It is related to classic control engineering and cybernetics. So first, to really illustrate the theory, I want you to watch a video. It's very simple. I want you to work out what the person on the left was instructed to do. Both of the people in the video, you'll see their hands holding pens. The one on the right is experimenter. Both of the pens are going to leave a trace on the page, but the question is, what was the person on the left told to do? So just watch this brief video. Now you might want to pause the video and have a think, have a guess. You might come up with more than one idea of what the person on the left was told to do. These are the results when we've conducted this study. Most people do not get the correct instruction. It's about 1% in the first study we did. In the second study, where we drew people's attention to what the person was controlling, still a very small minority of people got the correct answer. We built a computer model to show that this task works through PCT, through controlling input. But what is that perceptual input that's controlled? It's actually the distance of the knot from the dot. So the person on the left was told to keep the knot over the dot. So even though it looked like they were maybe copying the picture of the other person, doing the opposite, drawing something, actually what they were doing, what they knew they were doing, is keeping a knot over the dot. The other behaviours that you observed were their means to achieve that. And when you ask people after doing this what they remember, many of them don't remember those specific behaviours. Okay, so this is the idea of what control is according to PCT. Control is achieving and maintaining a variable at a desired value through actions and changes in action that counteract the effect of disturbances to that variable. So in that video, the disturbances was the person on the right pulling at the elastic band. And the idea of PCT is that we have these knots over dots for everything. Goldilocks had a just right temperature of her porridge. When we're social distancing, we have a distance that we're trying to maintain. Many of us have a level of anxiety that we find as as tolerable, and we want to kind of control and keep it within certain bounds. And even higher level things like sense of justice. Many of us live our lives doing things to try and maintain that sense for ourselves. The second principle I'd like to share with you is conflict. This is when a variable is controlled at 2 or more different values. I'm going to give you some examples from the research, but it's, for example, about wanting to be very excited and wanting to be calm. It's about wanting to be close to a spider, but also to want to get far away from the spider. So the person's got incompatible references for the same experience. We did a study on this in bipolar disorder with a very large sample. People with bipolar disorder, people with unipolar depression, and non-clinical controls. And we saw how we could predict which group they would be in. We had only 2 factors from a self-report scale. One of these were positive beliefs, things that people believe that encourage them to enhance their excitement. And the second was their negative beliefs. These are things people do to try and suppress that level of activation and excitement. We put those into the regression, but critically we put the conflict in, the simultaneous attempt to try and enhance and suppress the same experience. What we found is that if you have each of these by themselves, they don't predict bipolar status, but if you have both of them, then that's a critical factor. So I will show you this in the graph. Along the x-axis is positive appraisals. If you only have positive appraisals, the stronger that they are, the less likely you are to have bipolar disorder, and that's why this thick line goes downwards. But if you have positive appraisals and negative appraisals, high levels of negative appraisals, then the stronger those positive appraisals, the greater likelihood it is of having bipolar disorder, right up to over 90% when these conflicting appraisals are combined together. We can also look at conflict within anxiety and phobias. The classic approach is to simply regard approach or avoidance as a response to a threat stimulus, like in the top diagram. But a control theory perspective is more complex. The idea is that the person controls a perceptual variable, and for this it is distance from the feared object. And the person's in conflict, which means that on the one hand they want to overcome their fears, which entails getting closer, but on the other hand they want to stay a defensive distance away, which means getting further. And so there's this oscillation between the two, or a compromise in behaviour that people experience as uncertainty and distress. And so we studied this using a computerized version of an exposure task, where highly spider fearful students were given the opportunity to face their spider fears. They needed to attempt to control a spider image that moved towards or away from them on its own accord. And then we allocated them to either conditions where they had a great amount of control over their distance from the spider, or virtually no control. And what you find is that the benefits of exposure only came to those participants who could control their exposure. These were people that got closer after doing the task, and 2 weeks later they had less avoidance of spiders. So control is critical. Where does the hierarchy and the levels come in? I talked to you about these goals of getting closer versus further away. We need to ask and go up a level. Why would someone want to be closer? At a high level, it's to be a strong person. Why would they want to be further away? At a high level, it's to be safe. So this is the way that a hierarchy is formed in PCT, with the idea that those goals themselves at the mid-level are set by an even higher level. For example, to be myself, to be a well-rounded person. And so this is how we understand a spider phobia using PCT. Now the idea in the real nervous system is that we have many of these control loops interconnected, and it's actually a vast network, probably a branching network, a bit like a root system, with the high level goals, the more abstract and long-term ones at the top. And actually, within neuroscience, Henry Yin at Duke University has been doing a series of studies using animals and neural measures to find which perceptual variables they're controlling at different levels and which elements of the brain are being processed in this hierarchical organisation. Now, I've not got time to go into this in detail, but Henry Yin's work is an ideal resource for looking at the neuroscience of control. So how does this work clinically? What we need to do is we need to help the person get that right balance of facing and avoiding their experience, of being strong but also being safe. And there is no absolute solution to this, because it's important for that person to be strong and also to be safe. So we need to go to a level above. We need to go to a meta level where they can regulate and manage and look at those goals in a new perspective. And within PCT, there's a process called reorganization, which is the trial and error way we form new perceptions of our goals at a higher level. And reorganization actually is a intrinsic system that's involved in all learning, for example, in infant development. And we've produced a suite of interventions that tap into this capacity for people to be able to bring their awareness to their conflicting goals, sustain it there, and explore and elaborate them. We have the method of levels, a one-to-one therapy, take control course, a group course, an artificial therapist called Milo, and 4Ds for dealing with distress, a very brief intervention for workplace stress. In terms of our research, we're conducting pragmatic trials. There's many of those on method levels published, and a pilot randomized controlled trial of method levels. And we're doing RCTs of these other interventions. We found that MOL has evidence to be unique, very distinct from other psychological therapies because of its focus on helping someone to maintain awareness, actually purely through asking curious questions of them as they describe a problem. Method levels has been shown in certain studies to be particularly efficient to achieve change within a smaller number of sessions than benchmarked services. And we've also done various studies on the mechanism. So, for example, recently we looked at how method of levels tends to bring people's awareness to higher level goals, to longer term goals in their lives, compared to engaging in a similar amount of time with a behavioural therapy designed for more practical actions. So overall, what I'd like to summarise is that this is a sample from a much larger research programme. If you want to see more about specific studies, you can look at these Twitter sites. I've not talked today about computational modelling and virtual reality. That is a focus going forward, and there's other talks and articles on that. We're planning larger scale trials. I'm also working on a general view of consciousness as universal perceptual control, which is work in progress. But I guess the take-home message from this talk is that we need to be thinking about psychology and psychiatry and mental phenomena as a whole in terms of what variables a person is controlling, these multiple just right states that they're controlling, using continuous dynamic changes in behaviour, and move away from the straightforward linear stimulus response approach to psychology and psychiatry. Thank you.